Iran just got hit by a weapon it had never faced before, and the timing could not have been more brutal. In the same stretch of days that American forces pounded missile storage sites and coastal defenses on Greater Tunb Island, the United States quietly rolled out a completely new tool of war, one that had never been used in actual combat by American forces until this exact moment. Small, fast, unmanned, and armed. Heard about this yet? You are about to understand why military analysts are calling it one of the most significant debuts of this entire war. Let's set the stage first, because context matters enormously here. Greater Tunb is a small island sitting right near the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, a stretch of water so important to global trade that a meaningful share of the world's oil and gas physically has to pass through it every single day. Iran has occupied Greater Tunb since 1971, alongside 2 other nearby islands, and has used its location for years to help project military power over the strait. When American forces struck Greater Tunb with precision munitions, hitting coastal defense systems and cruise missile storage and launch sites in a focused 90-minute operation, it was part of a much larger campaign aimed squarely at degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial vessels moving through that critical waterway. The strategic value of an island as small as Greater Tunb is easy to underestimate if you only glance at a map, and outside observers unfamiliar with the region often assume it barely matters at all. It sits close enough to the main shipping channel that missile batteries positioned there can threaten vessels transiting one of the narrowest and most heavily trafficked sections of the entire, most consequential pieces of maritime geography on the planet, since roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas exports have historically depended on tankers being able to pass through it safely. Losing the ability to defend that corridor effectively strips Iran of one of its most important sources of leverage in this entire conflict. That strike on Greater Tunb did not happen in isolation. It came during the 5th consecutive day of American military action against Iran, a stretch of nonstop pressure that followed the collapse of an earlier ceasefire agreement. President Trump had publicly promised that the bombardment would intensify, warning in blunt terms that Iran would be hit very hard one night, hit very hard again the next night, and that the following week things would get, in his words, really bad for Tehran. That kind of open public escalation warning is rare, and it set the tone for exactly the kind of aggressive, technologically advanced campaign that followed, one that would ultimately blend conventional airstrikes with an entirely new category of naval weapon within the span of a single week. But the real story here, the part that genuinely caught people off guard, happened just a couple of days before that strike on Greater Tunb, during a separate wave of American operations against Iran's naval infrastructure. For the very first time in the history of American combat operations, the United States military used armed, unmanned boats to strike an enemy target. Not remote-controlled boats guided by a pilot watching a screen the whole time, but genuinely autonomous, one-way attack surface vessels, essentially small robotic speedboats packed with explosives, sent on a single mission with no intention of ever coming back. The target was Bandar Abbas Naval Base, the headquarters of Iran's entire navy, sitting right along the coastline of the Strait of Hormuz. 3 of these unmanned boats, known as Corsair vessels, sped toward the port under their own guidance and slammed directly into a submarine and ship maintenance facility. United States Central Command released a short video afterward, showing the boats individually approaching the shoreline, followed by a first-person view from the bow of one vessel closing in on a dock that appeared to be sheltering a small submarine. The final seconds of that footage show 3 distinct explosions and a large plume of smoke rising into the air. That video, roughly 24 seconds long and released without any additional commentary attached, quickly circulated widely once military analysts and defense journalists began picking it apart frame by frame. Independent observers noted the same dock appeared in more than one of the individual clips, suggesting a coordinated approach from multiple angles rather than a single vessel striking repeatedly. Analysts also pointed to geolocation data included alongside the footage, allowing outside observers to confirm the precise coordinates of the facility that had been targeted, adding an unusual layer of transparency to a strike that, in an earlier era of warfare, might never have been documented and shared so openly with the public at all. Central Command was unusually direct about the significance of this moment, stating plainly that this marked the first time American forces had ever employed sea drones in actual combat operations. That is not a small claim to make, and it was not made lightly either. The United States Navy has experimented with unmanned surface vessels for years, testing them, refining them, integrating them slowly into broader operations, but none of that experimentation had ever crossed over into an actual armed strike against an enemy target until this exact mission against Iran. So what exactly is this weapon, and why does it matter so much that Iran genuinely had no answer for it? The Corsair is a 24-foot autonomous boat built by a Texas-based defense company that only unveiled the design publicly back in October of 2024. It can carry a payload of up to 1,000 pounds, and whether that payload is sensors for surveillance missions or explosives for an actual strike, and it can travel more than 1,000 nautical miles while reaching top speeds above 35 knots. That combination of range, speed, and payload capacity makes it an extraordinarily versatile platform, capable of everything from quiet reconnaissance missions to sudden devastating strikes against coastal infrastructure. Saronic itself described the mission afterward in a public statement. What makes this weapon so difficult to defend against is not any single specification on a technical sheet. It is the fundamental nature of the platform itself. A small, fast-moving, low-profile boat skimming across open water is an inherently difficult thing to detect and track using traditional naval defense systems, which were largely designed decades ago to identify much larger vessels, aircraft, and missiles. Radar systems, built to spot incoming warships or fighter jets, often struggle against something this small, this fast, and this close to the water's surface. By the time a target like this becomes visible on standard detection systems, there is often very little time left to respond before impact. That kind of detection problem gets even worse at night or in choppy sea conditions. Exactly the kind of environment where a small, autonomous boat blends most easily into background clutter on a radar screen, and where human lookouts stationed along the would be large enough, or moving predictably enough, for existing sensor systems to pick it up with enough lead time to respond. And because the Corsair operates as a one-way attack vessel, there is no human pilot sitting inside making split-second decisions that a defender might be able to predict or disrupt through electronic countermeasures aimed at a remote operator. The boat is essentially a guided missile that happens to float, sent on a single mission with a specific target already programmed in, relying on its own onboard systems to navigate the final approach. That autonomy removes one of the more common vulnerabilities that defenders typically try to exploit, namely jamming the communication link between an operator and their machine. This is not a completely novel concept in the broader sense. Ukraine has used exactly this kind of unmanned surface vessel with devastating effectiveness against Russia's navy throughout its own war, forcing Russian commanders to relocate large portions of their fleet away from occupied Crimea entirely and pour enormous resources into developing counter-drone boat defenses that still struggle to keep pace. Houthi forces in Yemen have also experimented with explosive-laden surface craft against naval vessels in the Red Sea, another example of how this category of weapon has already been proving itself dangerous and difficult to stop on battlefields far beyond just this specific conflict with Iran. Ukraine's success with these unmanned surface vessels against a much larger and more established Russian navy has become one of the defining stories of that entire war. And it clearly did not go unnoticed by American military planners watching closely from thousands of kilometers away. Russian naval commanders spent months trying to adapt, experimenting with everything from adapted infrared, guided air, to air missiles repurposed for anti-boat defense, to sweeping changes in how the fleet positions itself around occupied territory. Even with all of that adaptation, Ukrainian drone boats have continued scoring hits against Russian vessels well into 2026, a track record that speaks directly to how genuinely difficult this category of threat remains even for a determined, well-resourced defender given enough time to prepare. What makes the American deployment against Iran particularly notable, though, is the speed at which this specific system moved from an unveiled prototype to a combat-proven weapon. The company behind the Corsair only showed the design publicly in October of 2024. By December of 2025, it had already secured a production contract with the Navy worth close to $400 million, reportedly focused specifically on this vessel. And by July of 2026, less than already been used in a real combat strike against a foreign naval base. That timeline represents an almost unheard of pace for a modern weapons program, especially one built by a relatively young company founded only a few years earlier. Traditional naval weapons programs at major defense contractors routinely take a decade or longer to move from initial design through testing, evaluation, and eventual deployment into active combat units. A brand new ship class, for instance, can spend years in development before its keel is even laid, followed by additional years of sea trials before it ever deploys with a fully worked-up crew. Compare that glacial pace to the Corsair's journey, from a public unveiling to a headline grabbing combat strike in under 21 months, and you start to understand just how dramatically the pace of naval innovation has shifted in this new era of unmanned systems. If you are finding this breakdown genuinely useful, go ahead and hit that like button right now, because the story behind how fast this weapon reached the battlefield gets even more interesting from here. The unit responsible for fielding these Corsair vessels is Task Force 59, a Navy group specifically focused on unmanned operations. Based out of Bahrain, working in coordination with the broader artificial intelligence and drone task force that has been deploying these boats into the region since late March of this year. Interestingly, before this weekend's strike marked their combat debut, Corsair boats had already been quietly proving their value in an entirely different role. Just the month before, a Corsair vessel assisted in rescuing crew members from an American Apache helicopter that had crashed off the coast of Oman, demonstrating the platform's versatility well before it ever fired a shot in anger. Task Force 59 itself has an interesting origin story worth understanding because it did not appear out of nowhere in response to this specific conflict. The unit was established years earlier specifically to explore how artificial intelligence and unmanned systems could reshape naval operations across the Middle East, running exercises and pilot programs long before Iran ever became the primary focus of its attention. That patient, methodical groundwork, built up over years of testing and refinement in a relatively low pressure environment, is a big part of why the Corsair was ready to perform reliably the moment commanders decided to actually use it offensively rather than experimentally. That detail matters more than it might seem at first glance, because it shows this was not some rushed, desperate deployment of an untested piece of technology thrown into battle out of necessity. This was a system that had already been operating in the region for months, proving its reliability in support roles before commanders decided it was ready to be used offensively. When Central Command's spokesperson addressed the milestone publicly, he specifically framed it as part of an ongoing pattern, noting that American forces deployed to the region have repeatedly employed new capabilities throughout this conflict to accomplish their objectives, and that quickly equipping troops with cutting-edge tools remains an active operational priority. The broader context surrounding this weapon's debut makes it even more significant. This strike against Bandar Abbas came as part of a much larger wave of American operations that included more than 300 targets hit across southern Iran in a single week alone. American forces used fighter aircraft, naval vessels, one-way attack aerial drones, and these one-way attack sea drones together in a single coordinated campaign, marking multiple combat firsts within the very same set of operations. Central Command specifically confirmed that this represented the first combat use of both categories of unmanned one-way attack systems, aerial and maritime, within the same broader offensive push. Think about what that combination actually represents from a strategic standpoint. Iran's entire military doctrine around defending the Strait of Hormuz has long relied heavily on small, fast attack boats and coastal missile batteries, weapons specifically designed to threaten larger, more expensive naval vessels and commercial shipping alike. In fact, reporting on the same wave of strikes noted that Washington appeared to be systematically targeting exactly that category of Iranian military asset, its fleet of heavily armed fast attack boats, recognizing them as one of Tehran's most effective tools for menacing the strait. That same wave of strikes also hit dozens of other targets across multiple Iranian cities in a single week, including air defense systems, coastal radar installations, and additional missile and drone launch sites, underscoring just how broad and coordinated this entire offensive campaign had become by the time the Corsair made its combat debut. By introducing its own unmanned attack boats into this exact same operational space, the United States effectively turned Iran's own preferred category of weapon back against it, using a small, fast, hard-to-detect platform to strike directly at the facilities responsible for maintaining and repairing Iran's naval fleet in the first place. There's a certain symmetry to that choice that goes beyond simple technical capability. It sends a message that the very same asymmetric tools Iran has relied on for years to threaten a much larger conventional navy can now be turned directly against Iran's own coastline with tremendous precision. For decades, Iran's entire regional military strategy has leaned heavily on exactly this kind of asymmetric thinking, building a doctrine around swarms of cheap, fast, expendable boats, specifically because it could never hope to match the size or firepower of a conventional American carrier strike group in a direct, symmetrical confrontation. That strategy worked precisely because larger, more expensive naval forces historically struggled to counter swarms of small, disposable attack craft cheaply and efficiently. Watching the United States adopt a strikingly similar approach, deploying its own cheap, fast, expendable unmanned boats, rather than relying purely on multi-million-dollar missiles fired from distant warships, represents a kind of role reversal that Iranian military planners likely did not see coming this specific way, even if they understood in general terms that unmanned systems were reshaping warfare elsewhere around the world. Iran's response to all of this has been defiant, at least publicly. A foreign ministry spokesperson said the country currently has no plans for negotiations and remains focused entirely on defense, a signal that Tehran has no intention of backing down despite facing weapon systems it has never had to counter before. Iran's armed forces have continued launching retaliatory missile and drone strikes against American military facilities in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait, demonstrating that even in the face of this new technological pressure, Tehran retains both the capability and the willingness to strike back across the wider region. But defiance in public statements does not necessarily translate into an actual working defense against a weapon. This fundamentally different from anything Iran's Navy has trained against before. Iranian coastal defense doctrine has been built up over decades around countering large surface warships, submarines, aircraft, and conventional cruise missiles, threats with well-understood radar signatures and predictable flight or approach profiles. None of that institutional knowledge transfers cleanly to detecting and stopping a small autonomous boat with almost no radar cross-section, approaching at wave-top height under its own onboard guidance system. But there is a meaningful difference between striking back against fixed military bases using conventional missiles and drones, something Iran has extensive experience, defending against, encountering, and developing an effective defense against a completely new category of weapon it has never encountered in actual combat before. Naval mines, small boat swarms, and coastal missile batteries have all been part of Iran's playbook for defending the Strait for years, but none of that experience translates cleanly into stopping a small, autonomous, explosive-laden speedboat that requires no human pilot and can approach from unpredictable angles at high speed. This is precisely why the framing of Iran never seeing this weapon coming carries real weight beyond just dramatic headline language. It is not simply that Iran failed to anticipate this specific strike on this specific night. It is that an entire category of naval warfare, autonomous surface attack vessels operating without any onboard crew, represents a genuinely new challenge that existing Iranian coastal defense doctrine was never built to counter in the first place. Adapting to a threat like that requires more than tactical adjustments. It requires rethinking entire defensive systems from the ground up, a process that takes months or years, not days. Iran does have some naval mine capability that could theoretically complicate future unmanned surface vessel operations, with estimates suggesting the country possesses somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 naval mines, along with the vast majority of the small boats and mine laying vessels needed to deploy them throughout the strait. Reports have even suggested that Iran itself has lost precise track of exactly where all of its previously deployed mines are currently located, an unsettling detail that highlights just how chaotic and dangerous these waters have become for anyone trying to navigate them safely, American forces and ordinary commercial shipping alike. That kind of uncertainty cuts both ways, though, and arguably works against Iran just as much as it complicates things for the United States. A minefield that even its own creator cannot map with confidence is a hazard to everyone operating in that stretch of water, including Iranian vessels attempting to move supplies or reinforcements along the same coastline. It also creates an ongoing diplomatic liability for Tehran, since any commercial vessel damaged or lost to an unmarked mine, regardless of its flag or origin, tends to generate exactly the kind of international outrage and pressure that Iran can least afford while already isolated economically and facing sustained military pressure on multiple fronts. That mine threat represents one of the few potential tools Iran retains that could meaningfully complicate future unmanned surface vessel operations, since mines do not require the kind of real-time detection and tracking that has proven so difficult against fast-moving autonomous boats. But mines are a blunt, indiscriminate weapon, just as likely to damage a neutral commercial vessel as an American military asset, and deploying them at scale risks further alienating international partners who depend on the strait remaining open for global trade. It is a defensive option that comes with enormous strategic costs attached. The United States, for its part, has already been actively working to counter exactly this kind of mine threat well before the Corsair strike ever took place. Back in April, Central Command announced it had begun deploying underwater drones specifically to help clear safe passages through the strait, establishing what officials described as a new corridor that could be shared with the broader maritime shipping industry to encourage the continued flow of commercial trade, despite the surrounding conflict. That earlier deployment of underwater clearance drones and this more recent combat debut of surface attack drones together paint a clear picture of just how central unmanned systems have become to America's entire strategy for keeping this critical waterway open and functional. Meanwhile, American officials have made clear that this Corsair strike represents just one piece of a much broader effort to rapidly field cheap, effective drone technology across the entire Middle East theater. Just last December, Central Command announced the launch of a dedicated task force specifically designed to quickly deliver low-cost, effective drone capabilities directly into the hands of warfighters on the ground. that task force has already assembled its own squadron of low-cost unmanned combat attack drones, interestingly enough, built as reverse-engineered versions of the very same Iranian-designed Shahed drones that have caused so much damage in conflicts across the region, including the ongoing war in Ukraine. The task force, known internally as Task Force Scorpion Strike, represents exactly the same philosophy driving the Corsair program, just applied to the skies instead of the sea, rather than waiting years for a traditional defense contractor to design an entirely new aerial drone from scratch. American planners essentially took an existing, proven, cheaply manufactured design already circulating on battlefields around the world and adapted it for their own use. That approach prioritizes speed and battlefield relevance over the kind of ground-up originality that has traditionally defined American weapons development. And the results so far suggest that trade-off has been well worth making given how quickly these systems have reached active combat zones. There is something almost poetic about that detail. The same basic drone design Iran has exported to Russia, and that Russia has used relentlessly against Ukrainian cities for years, has now been reverse-engineered by American defense companies and turned into a tool actively used against Iran itself. Warfare has a strange way of circling back on itself. Like that, technology developed by one side eventually finding its way, in modified form, into the hands of an entirely different combatant on a completely different battlefield. The Navy has also been actively working to expand its broader family of unmanned surface vessels well beyond just the Corsair platform, recently reshaping its acquisition programs to focus on what officials call the medium unmanned surface vessel marketplace. Requirements for these next-generation designs call for vessels capable of traveling 2,500 nautical miles at speeds of 25 knots even in rough sea conditions, while carrying up to 25 metric tons of payload for missions, ranging from direct strikes to surveillance and logistics support. Several companies, including the makers of the Corsair, have already been selected to participate in its sea testing scheduled to continue through this coming October, with successful vendors receiving substantial follow-on production contracts worth millions of dollars. That shift toward a marketplace-style acquisition model represents a meaningful departure from how the Navy has traditionally built its fleet. Rather than selecting a single contractor to design and build an entire new class of vessel over many years, officials are instead running a competitive process involving multiple companies simultaneously, letting real-world at-sea performance during testing determine which designs eventually earn larger production contracts. That approach mirrors exactly the kind of rapid iteration and competitive pressure that has defined Ukraine's own drone development ecosystem, where dozens of small manufacturers compete to produce the most effective and reliable systems, with battlefield performance ultimately deciding which designs scale up and which quietly fade away. Non-traditional shipbuilders, companies that would never have been considered serious contenders for a Navy shipbuilding contract even a few years ago, are now being explicitly invited to compete for this new generation of unmanned vessels. That openness to smaller, more agile companies outside the traditional defense industrial base is precisely what allowed a company as young as Saronic to move from an initial design unveiling to an actual combat strike in under 2 years. A timeline that would have been almost unimaginable working through the Navy's older, more conventional shipbuilding relationships with a small handful of massive established contractors. That broader investment tells you this Corsair strike against Bandar Abbas was never meant to be a one-time novelty. It represents the opening move in what appears to be a much larger, deliberate shift toward unmanned maritime warfare as a permanent, expanding piece of how the United States military intends to operate going forward, not just in this specific conflict with Iran, but across future operations anywhere naval power projection matters. When you combine that with the aerial one-way attack drones being fielded through the same rapid acquisition task force, a clear pattern starts to emerge of a military actively racing to close the gap between traditional, expensive weapons platforms and the kind of cheap, fast, adaptable unmanned systems that have already proven so effective in other conflicts around the world. If this kind of deep dive into how fast military technology is evolving on real battlefields is something you want to keep following, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because these debuts are happening faster than almost anyone outside the defense industry realizes. Stepping back to look at the bigger picture, this moment fits into a much larger pattern that has defined military innovation throughout 2026. Whether it is Ukraine's flying shotgun drones solving a problem that traditional electronic warfare could not touch, or Ukrainian-style interceptor drones being adopted en masse by American forces after burning through expensive Patriot missiles against cheap Iranian Shaheds, or now this Corsair boat striking directly at the heart of Iran's naval infrastructure, the common thread running through nearly every major development this year is the same. Cheap, fast, adaptable unmanned systems are increasingly outperforming and outpacing the kind of expensive traditional weapons platforms that dominated military thinking for decades. It is genuinely remarkable how many different branches of the same underlying story have played out across completely separate conflicts in the same calendar year, a war, fought primarily on land in Eastern Europe. A maritime standoff centered on one of the world's most important shipping choke points in the Persian Gulf. Two conflicts, thousands of kilometers apart, involving entirely different militaries and completely different terrain, yet both increasingly defined by the exact same underlying shift toward cheap, autonomous, rapidly iterated weapons. Siren now finds itself on the receiving end of exactly the kind of technological disadvantage that Ukraine has spent years trying to overcome against Russia. A larger, more established conventional navy suddenly facing a threat it has no reliable answer for. Not because the enemy has more resources or a bigger fleet, but because the enemy figured out how to deploy cheap, fast, unmanned systems more effectively and more quickly than the existing defensive doctrine could adapt to counter. That kind of asymmetric technological gaps tends to matter far more in modern conflict than raw troop numbers or the size of a traditional military budget. There is an important distinction worth drawing here, though, because unlike Ukraine, which built its entire unmanned systems ecosystem out of sheer necessity while facing an existential threat with limited outside support, the United States possesses enormous existing resources, a mature defense industrial base, and the ability to rapidly scale production of a proven design once it has demonstrated success in combat. That combination suggests the gap between American and Iranian naval capabilities in this specific domain could widen even further in the months ahead, rather than narrowing, as more Corsair vessels and similar unmanned platforms get deployed across the region in growing numbers. What happens next remains genuinely uncertain. Iran will almost certainly begin working on countermeasures specifically designed to detect and intercept small, fast, autonomous surface vessels approaching its coastline, likely drawing on lessons learned from watching how Russia has struggled against similar Ukrainian tactics in the Black Sea for years without ever fully solving the problem. But developing an effective, reliable defense against this entirely new category of threat will take time, and time is exactly the resource Iran does not currently have, given how relentlessly American forces have continued escalating pressure across multiple domains simultaneously throughout this latest wave of strikes. For now, what we know is this. Somewhere along the Iranian coastline, an entirely new chapter of naval warfare quietly opened, marked not by some massive headline-grabbing weapon, but by 3 small autonomous boats slipping past defenses that were never designed to stop them. Iran's navy took a direct hit at its own headquarters from a weapon type it had never faced. Before, in the very same broader campaign that pounded missile sites on Greater Tunb Island and pushed the entire Strait of Hormuz closer to a full and total standstill. Whatever comes next in this rapidly escalating conflict, one thing is now clear beyond any doubt. The character of naval warfare in this region has permanently changed, and Iran is only just beginning to understand exactly what that means. There is a broader lesson here too, one that extends well past this single conflict and well past Iran itself. Every military planner, watching this war unfold in Tehran, in Moscow, in Beijing, and everywhere else with a coastline worth defending, just received a very public, very well-documented demonstration of exactly how quickly a small, agile defense company can turn an unveiled prototype into a proven combat weapon. That lesson will not be lost on anyone paying attention. And it almost guarantees that similar unmanned surface systems, built by other countries entirely, will start showing up in other conflicts around the world far sooner than anyone might have expected just a few years ago.